Your chest tightens before your mind even catches up. A tone shift, a pause, a look you can't read. And suddenly you're replaying everything you said, everything you didn't say, wondering where you messed up. Not because something actually happened, but because you've been trained to believe that someone else's emotions are your responsibility. And here's the truth that changes everything. That anxiety isn't love. It's conditioning. You weren't born scanning the emotional, whether like your survival depended on it. You learned it. Somewhere along the way, you absorbed the idea that being a good man meant being emotionally available at all times, adaptable at all costs, calm even when your insides were unraveling. You learned that peace was something you earned by keeping someone else comfortable. And no one told you how dangerous that belief would become when it followed you into adult relationships. At first, it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like maturity. You're the steady one, the understanding one, the one who doesn't escalate, doesn't complain, doesn't make things harder. You tell yourself this is what strength looks like. You tell yourself this is love. But slowly, almost invisibly, something starts to erode. You stop checking in with yourself. You stop asking what you need. Your internal compass gets quieter every time you override it to manage someone else's mood. And one day you realize you don't even know what you feel anymore, only whether things are calm. That's the trap no one talks about. Emotional over-responsibility doesn't explode your life. It drains it. You become hyper-aware of everything outside you and strangely disconnected from everything inside you. A sigh becomes a signal. Silence becomes a threat. Peace becomes temporary, fragile, dependent on how well you perform. And you start living in reaction mode, always adjusting, always anticipating, always trying to get back to neutral. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Fixing becomes your identity. Not because you love fixing, but because fixing feels safer than facing the possibility that someone else might sit with their own discomfort. You apologize even when you don't understand what you're apologizing for. You explain yourself when no explanation was asked for. You rush to smooth things over because unresolved tension feels like failure. But what you're really doing is teaching both of you the same lesson, that their emotional regulation is your job. And the cost of that lesson is your sense of self. Because when you're always fixing, you're never resting. When you're always managing, you're never present. You start measuring your worth by how little friction you create, how quickly you restore calm, how effectively you disappear when things get tense. That's not partnership. That's emotional labor disguised as loyalty. Guilt is the glue that keeps this pattern intact. Not loud guilt, quiet guilt. The kind that shows up as a heavy feeling in your chest when you consider saying no. The kind that whispers that you're selfish for wanting space, cold for needing clarity, wrong for choosing yourself. And the most important thing to understand is this. Guilt doesn't always mean you did something wrong. Sometimes it means you touched a boundary you were never allowed to have. Watch what happens when you stop immediately responding to emotional shifts. Watch how uncomfortable it feels to let silence exist without rushing to fill it. That discomfort is the withdrawal. You're breaking a habit your nervous system learned a long time ago. And here's the paradox. Guilt doesn't disappear before you act. It fades after you do. After you hold your ground. After you don't explain. After you don't fix what isn't yours to fix. There's a moment in every man's life when something quietly clicks. Not a dramatic argument. Not a final blow-up. Just a question that refuses to go away. Why am I so tired? Why do I feel smaller here? Why does my peace feel conditional? And when that question lands, you start seeing patterns instead of incidents. You realize this isn't about one bad day or one misunderstanding. It's about a dynamic where one person externalizes everything and the other absorbs it all. Being the emotional dumping ground changes you. Your pain becomes inconvenient. Your exhaustion gets overlooked. You only feel okay when they feel okay. And eventually, You confuse the absence of conflict with connection. You cling to temporary calm even though it only arrives after you've sacrificed yourself again. That's not love. That's survival. The wake-up moment isn't anger. It's clarity. You realize that respect feels different from obligation, that mutual care feels different from constant accommodation, and you start measuring relationships by a new standard. Do I feel grounded here, or do I feel managed? That question alone can dismantle years of confusion. Walking away, or emotionally stepping back, feels like failure when you've been taught that endurance equals strength. But endurance without reciprocity is self-neglect. Sometimes leaving isn't quitting. It's finishing. Finishing a chapter that taught you everything it could, at a cost you're no longer willing to pay. And the strange thing is, when the chaos fades, you don't feel empty. You feel quiet. And that quiet lets you hear yourself again. Here's the turning point. You stop trying to control what isn't yours. You stop answering every emotional call to action. You don't become cold. You become clear. You don't withdraw your care. You withdraw your self-betrayal. Boundaries replace arguments. Presence replaces performance. And you say, calmly and without drama, I'll handle mine. You handle yours. That's authority, not dominance, not aggression. Internal authority. The kind that doesn't chase approval or panic at disapproval. The kind that understands that real connection only exists between two people who can stand on their own. And when you reclaim that authority, something remarkable happens. Your body relaxes. Your thoughts slow down. Your energy comes back online. You remember who you were before you thought love meant carrying everything. You were never meant to be the emotional solution. You were meant to be a whole person. And the moment you stop taking responsibility for what was never yours, you don't lose love. You make space for the kind that doesn't cost you your sanity. How men are conditioned into emotional overresponsibility. Most men don't step into emotional overresponsibility because they're weak. They step into it because they were rewarded for it early. Somewhere growing up, you learned that being good meant being easy to deal with. You were praised for staying calm, for not causing trouble, for understanding other people's feelings before they had to explain them. Maybe you became the mediator in your family. Maybe you learned to read the room because someone else's emotions were unpredictable. Maybe love felt safest when you stayed quiet and adapted. Whatever the origin, the lesson was clear long before you could name it. Your value came from keeping things stable. That conditioning follows you into adulthood almost unnoticed. You don't see it as a burden at first. You see it as maturity. You're the guy who listens, the guy who gives the benefit of the doubt, the guy who doesn't overreact. And the world reinforces this identity. You're told this makes you emotionally intelligent, evolved, solid. But what no one explains is the hidden trade being made. You're not learning how to share responsibility for emotions. You're learning how to carry them alone. Over time, that role hardens into an expectation. Not one that's spoken, but one that's felt. If tension shows up, you assume it's yours to dissolve. If someone is upset, you assume you miss something. If there's distance, you assume you failed to maintain connection. You don't ask whether the emotion belongs to you. You ask how quickly you can make it go away. And slowly, without realizing it, emotional labor replaces mutual understanding. The most dangerous part is that this pattern feels moral. You tell yourself you're being patient, compassionate, selfless. You tell yourself this is what commitment looks like. But patience without limits becomes self-erasure. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-neglect. And selflessness, when it's one-sided, becomes a quiet form of abandonment of the self. You're not choosing this role anymore. You're living inside it. What started as awareness becomes hypervigilance. You're always monitoring tone, timing, phrasing. You edit yourself before you speak. You soften truths before they land. You delay your needs until the right moment that never really comes. And because you've been conditioned to associate love with emotional stability, any disruption feels like a personal failure. You don't just feel discomfort, you feel guilt. This is how emotional over-responsibility takes root. Not through force, through approval, through praise, through the belief that if you're just understanding enough, patient enough, accommodating enough, everything will stay okay. But that belief comes at a cost. Because while you're busy managing everyone else's inner world, your own slowly goes unattended. And that's when the imbalance begins, long before the relationship ever looks unhealthy from the outside. The slow erosion of self. The loss doesn't happen all at once. There's no single moment where you can point and say, "That's when I disappeared." It happens quietly, in the spaces between interactions, in the way you stop checking in with yourself because someone else's emotional state feels more urgent, in the way your first instinct becomes adjustment instead of honesty. You don't wake up one day without a sense of self. You gradually trade it away for calm. At first, the changes feel small. You hesitate before speaking. You soften your opinions. You leave parts of yourself unsaid because it's easier than dealing with the reaction you expect. You tell yourself you'll bring it up later, when things are lighter, when the timing is better. But later never really comes. And every time you postpone yourself, your inner voice gets a little quieter. Over time, your awareness turns outward almost completely. You become an expert in someone else's moods, rhythms, and triggers, while becoming strangely disconnected from your own. You know exactly when something is off with them, but you can't name what's off inside you. Your emotional energy is spent anticipating, monitoring, preventing. Peace becomes something you manage, not something you feel. This is where the exhaustion sets in. Not the kind that comes from doing too much, but the kind that comes from never resting internally. Even on calm days, your body stays alert. Your nervous system doesn't fully power down because calm feels conditional. You're always waiting for the next shift, the next misunderstanding, the next moment where you'll have to step in and smooth things over. And that constant readiness drains you in ways you can't explain. The most painful part is how normal it starts to feel. You stop questioning why you're tired. You assume this is just what relationships require. You tell yourself everyone feels this way. And because nothing is openly wrong, you dismiss the emptiness growing underneath. But emptiness isn't the absence of love. It's the absence of self. Eventually, you notice something unsettling. You feel most like yourself when you're alone. The quiet feels safer than connection. Not because you don't want closeness, but because closeness has become a place where you're constantly bracing. That's when you realize the erosion has gone deep. You didn't lose yourself in conflict. You lost yourself in accommodation. And until that pattern is seen clearly, it keeps repeating, slowly hollowing out the person you once trusted yourself to be. Why fixing feels noble, but is actually avoidance. Fixing feels good at first because it gives you a role. When tension shows up, you know what to do. You move toward the problem. You ask questions. You apologize. You try to understand. And in the short term, it works. The emotional storm settles. The distance closes. Calm returns. Your body relaxes just enough to breathe again. That relief teaches you something powerful and dangerous at the same time. That fixing is the fastest way back to safety. Over time, fixing stops being a choice and becomes a reflex. You don't pause to ask whether the problem is yours. You jump straight into solution mode. You assume responsibility before anyone assigns it. And because this behavior is often praised as maturity or emotional intelligence, you rarely question it. You tell yourself you're being proactive, caring, strong. But underneath that story is something harder to face. Fixing isn't always about love. Often, it's about avoiding discomfort. When you fix, you don't have to sit with tension. You don't have to watch someone else struggle with their own emotions. You don't have to risk disapproval, withdrawal, or silence. Fixing keeps things moving. It prevents emotional stillness, and emotional stillness is where clarity tends to surface. So you stay busy. You explain. You reassure. You smooth things over before they have a chance to unfold. And in doing so, you unintentionally block the other person from developing their own emotional responsibility. There's a subtle shift that happens when fixing becomes constant. The relationship stops being about understanding and starts being about regulation. Your presence becomes a stabilizer, not a partner. And the more reliable you are in that role, the more it's expected of you. Problems don't get explored. They get handed to you. Discomfort doesn't get processed. It gets outsourced. And without realizing it, you train both yourself and the other person into a dynamic where growth is replaced by maintenance. This is where fixing turns into avoidance. Not avoidance of the other person, but avoidance of truth. Because fixing keeps you from asking the questions that would change everything. Why am I always the one restoring balance? What happens if I don't step in? What am I afraid will fall apart if I stop managing this? Those questions feel dangerous because they threaten the role that's been holding the relationship together. But that role is also the reason you're exhausted. The hardest truth to accept is that fixing often delays the very growth you hope for. As long as you absorb the emotional weight, the other person never has to carry it. As long as you rush to resolve, they never have to reflect. And as long as you believe that love means preventing discomfort, you'll keep avoiding the discomfort that would force real change. Fixing feels noble because it looks like care. But when it becomes constant, it's not care anymore. It's a way of keeping everything the same while slowly losing yourself in the process. The guilt loop no one talks about. Guilt doesn't arrive loudly. It seeps in. It shows up as a heavy feeling in your chest when you think about saying no, as hesitation before you bring up something that matters to you, as the instinct to apologize before you've even decided whether you did anything wrong. And because it's quiet and familiar, you assume it's telling you the truth. You assume guilt means you failed somehow. But most of the time, this guilt isn't about wrongdoing. It's about disruption. You feel it when you don't immediately respond to an emotional shift. You feel it when you hold a boundary a few seconds longer than usual. You feel it when you prioritize your own mental space and notice someone else's discomfort in response. That discomfort triggers the old conditioning, and the loop begins again. Their reaction becomes your responsibility. Your clarity becomes selfishness, and guilt steps in to pull you back into line. What keeps this loop alive is how quickly guilt is rewarded. The moment you explain yourself, soften your stance, or give in, the tension eases. The silence breaks. The mood improves. And your nervous system registers relief. That relief teaches your body that guilt was useful. It reinforces the belief that self-betrayal leads to peace. So the next time the feeling shows up, you comply faster. You don't even argue with it anymore. Over time, guilt starts running your inner world. You second-guess your thoughts before they form. You rehearse conversations in your head, editing out anything that might upset someone. You measure your choices not by whether they're right for you, but by how much emotional fallout they might cause. And slowly, your life stops being guided by truth and starts being guided by avoidance. The most disorienting part is that this guilt often appears when you're doing something healthy, setting a boundary, taking space, speaking honestly, choosing rest, because you were never taught to associate those actions with safety. You were taught to associate them with conflict, withdrawal, or punishment. So your body reacts as if you're doing something wrong, even when your mind knows you're doing something necessary. This is the part no one explains. Guilt doesn't disappear before you change. It fades after. After you hold the boundary. After you don't rush to explain. After you let someone else sit with their reaction without trying to manage it. Each time you do that, the loop weakens. Your nervous system learns a new association. That discomfort is survivable. That clarity doesn't destroy connection. That your worth doesn't collapse when someone else is unhappy. And when that realization starts to sink in, guilt loses its authority. It becomes information instead of a command. A signal that an old pattern is being challenged, not that you've done something wrong. And in that space, something shifts. Decisions become cleaner. Boundaries feel less heavy. And for the first time in a long time, your inner world begins to operate on truth instead of fear. The emotional dumping ground dynamic. There comes a point when you realize you're no longer sharing emotional space with someone. You're containing it. Their stress, their frustration, their confusion, their anger all seem to land on you, often without warning and without consent. Conversations don't feel like exchanges anymore. They feel like releases. And your role is to absorb, regulate, and stabilize whatever they don't want to hold themselves. At first, you tell yourself this is support, that this is what being there for someone looks like. But support has flow. It moves in both directions. What you're experiencing doesn't move. It piles up. And over time, you start carrying emotions that were never processed, never resolved, just transferred. You become the place where everything gets dropped so the other person can feel lighter, while you grow heavier. The pattern is subtle but consistent. When they're overwhelmed, you're expected to be available. When they're calm, your needs feel inconvenient. If you're tired, it's misunderstood. If you're quiet, it's questioned. And when you finally show signs of being full, of not having the capacity to take more, you're accused of pulling away or not caring enough. The irony is that you've been caring beyond your limits for a long time. This dynamic slowly teaches you that your emotions matter less. That your role is to hold, not to express. You learn to swallow frustration because bringing it up only creates more to manage. You delay your own feelings until things settle, but things rarely do. And eventually, you lose track of where your emotional world ends and theirs begins. Your inner life becomes a storage unit instead of a living space. One of the most damaging effects is how this rewires your sense of connection. You start feeling closest to someone only after you've been emptied. Calm becomes something that comes after collapse. And you confuse that relief with intimacy. You bond over the absence of conflict, not the presence of mutual care. That's not closeness. That's recovery. The hardest truth is that this dynamic often continues because it works for the other person. By unloading onto you, they avoid the discomfort of self-reflection and regulation. They don't have to slow down, sit with their emotions, or take responsibility for them. And as long as you're willing to be the container, there's no incentive for the pattern to change. Seeing this clearly can feel like betrayal, not by them, but by your own hope. You wanted to believe they were just going through something, that once things settled, it would be different. But patterns that repeat under stress aren't temporary. They're structural. And the moment you recognize that being someone's emotional dumping ground is costing you your clarity, your energy, and your sense of self, you face a choice. Continue absorbing what isn't yours, or step back and begin the work of reclaiming your inner space. The moment men wake up, the awakening doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It arrives quietly, almost gently, in the middle of an ordinary moment. You're not even in a fight. You're just tired. Not physically, but deep in your bones. And a thought surfaces that you can't push away this time. Why does this feel so heavy? Why does peace feel like something I have to earn? That question changes how you see everything. You stop zooming in on individual moments and start noticing the pattern beneath them. It's no longer about what was said last night or how a conversation ended. It's about the role you've been playing and how long you've been playing it. You realize that you're not reacting to one situation. You're responding to a system that's been quietly draining you for years. With that clarity comes a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief, because you finally understand why you've been so exhausted. Grief, because you see how much of yourself you've given away trying to keep things stable. You recognize that the version of you who kept fixing, absorbing, and apologizing wasn't broken. He was doing the best he could with the tools he had. But now you can see that those tools are no longer building a life. They're just keeping one afloat. This is where the internal shift begins. You start measuring relationships differently. Not by intensity or history or potential, but by how you feel inside them. Do you feel grounded or on edge? Clear or confused? Respected or managed? These questions cut through the noise because they bypass explanation and go straight to experience. And experience doesn't lie. The wake-up moment also brings a sobering realization. If nothing changes, this will be your life. The same cycles, the same exhaustion, the same quiet resentment building under the surface. And that realization doesn't make you angry. It makes you honest. Honest about your limits. Honest about your needs. Honest about what you can no longer carry. From that honesty, something new emerges. Not urgency, but resolve. You stop trying to convince. You stop trying to fix. You start paying attention to what happens when you don't step in. When you allow silence. When you let reactions pass without managing them. And in those moments, you feel something unfamiliar but deeply grounding. Self-trust. That's the moment men wake up. Not when they harden, but when they clarify. When they realize that strength isn't about enduring more. It's about knowing when something is costing too much. And once that awareness settles in, there's no going back to sleep. Because you've seen the truth. And the truth doesn't demand action right away. It simply refuses to be ignored. Why walking away feels like failure, but isn't. Walking away rarely feels like strength in the moment. It feels like loss, like wasted time, like admitting that everything you invested didn't turn into what you hoped it would be. When you've been taught that commitment means endurance, leaving feels like you're breaking a rule. It feels like you're giving up right before things could finally get better. And that belief alone keeps people stuck far longer than they should be. What makes it harder is the weight of history, shared memories, inside jokes, plans that never fully took shape. You don't just consider the present moment. You carry the past and the imagined future with you. And walking away starts to feel like erasing all of that. Like admitting that your patience, your effort, your sacrifices didn't pay off. But staying doesn't retroactively justify what it cost you. It only adds to the bill. There's also the fear of who you'll be without the role you've been playing. When your identity has been built around being the steady one, the fixer, the emotional anchor, stepping back feels disorienting. You wonder if you'll be seen as cold or selfish. You wonder if you'll lose your value without constant availability. That fear isn't about love. It's about conditioning. It's the echo of a system that taught you your worth came from what you could carry. The truth is, walking away doesn't always mean ending a relationship. Sometimes it means ending the version of yourself that kept betraying his own clarity to maintain connection. It means stepping out of dynamics that require you to be smaller, quieter, or less honest to survive. And that kind of departure is internal before it's ever external. What surprises most men is what happens after. The noise fades. The constant mental scanning stops. Your body begins to relax in ways you didn't know it was holding tension. You start thinking more clearly, sleeping more deeply, not because life suddenly became perfect, but because it became honest. Peace doesn't feel fragile anymore. It feels grounded. And that peace changes your perspective. You see how loud the chaos really was. How much energy went into managing something that never truly stabilized. You realize that leaving didn't create the emptiness you feared. It revealed the space where you can finally breathe. Walking away wasn't a failure of strength. It was the moment strength stopped being confused with self-neglect and started looking like self-respect. reclaiming authority over your inner world. The climax isn't a loud confrontation or a dramatic exit. It's a quiet, steady moment where you finally realize the truth. No one gets to dictate the temperature of your inner life, but you. All those years of bending, adjusting, absorbing, apologizing, and overfunctioning were born from a subtle lie that your value depended on someone else's stability. And that lie stops here, right now. This is the turning point. You stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" and start asking, "Why did I let this control me?" Every expectation, every emotional weight that wasn't yours begins to fall away, not violently, not in anger, but with the clarity of someone who finally sees the distinction between responsibility and ownership. Your boundaries stop being negotiable. Your peace is no longer currency for someone else's comfort. Authority over your inner world comes from presence, not reaction. It comes from choosing calm when chaos tries to dictate your day, from saying no without fear, from refusing guilt as a leash, from recognizing that someone else's dissatisfaction is theirs to manage, not yours to fix. And each time you honor that truth, the weight of years of self-betrayal lifts a little more. You also see the subtle victories, moments when silence becomes strength, not avoidance. Moments when restraint replaces overcompensation. Moments when clarity outweighs obligation. These are not dramatic milestones, but they're transformative. Each one reinforces the realization that your energy is yours to steward. Your focus is yours to protect. Your life is yours to design. Reclaiming authority isn't about punishing anyone or closing your heart. It's about opening it properly, for yourself first. It's about becoming steady enough that your presence is no longer a tool for someone else's regulation, but a reflection of your own groundedness. In that clarity, you discover a new form of power, the quiet, unwavering kind that doesn't need approval, doesn't chase validation, and refuses to shrink under anyone else's chaos. And in that moment, everything shifts. You no longer measure love by sacrifice or compliance. You no longer confuse endurance with worth. You no longer trade peace for someone else's temporary relief. You are awake, you are clear, and you are finally fully the author of your own life. A different kind of strength. True strength isn't measured by how much you can carry for others. It's measured by how fully you can stand in your own clarity without being shaken by someone else's chaos. It's not loud or performative. It doesn't demand recognition or gratitude. It's the quiet resilience that comes from knowing your worth and protecting it, no matter how uncomfortable it makes others feel. This kind of strength shows up in choices, not gestures. In boundaries, not sacrifices. In silence, not endless explanation. In walking away when staying means losing yourself. And in holding your ground when everyone expects you to bend. It's a power rooted in presence, not reaction. A power that grows every time you refuse to trade your peace for someone else's temporary comfort. When you embrace this strength, life looks different. You no longer measure connection by drama, guilt, or compliance. You seek partnerships where mutual care exists, where respect is the baseline, and where emotional ownership is shared. You see that love isn't proving yourself through labor. It's choosing alignment over obligation. And in that alignment, you finally reclaim the time, energy, and clarity that were quietly siphoned away for years. The journey isn't always easy. Old habits and fears will test you. Guilt will knock at the door. Drama will try to pull you back. But each time you respond from clarity instead of compulsion, you reinforce the truth. Your inner world belongs to you. And the life you build from this place of authority is not just peaceful. It's extraordinary, unshakable, and authentically yours. This is the different kind of strength. Not endurance disguised as loyalty. Not sacrifice disguised as love. But the quiet, unwavering power of a man who finally chooses himself, and in doing so, transforms everything around him.